Money can't buy love, but it can buy you a year to find it. Charlotte Grant sat alone in her gallery worth millions, facing the cruelest deadline imaginable: marry within 12 months or lose her father's entire estate. That's when she noticed Michael, a homeless man, reading by her back door, and made him the most unusual offer of his life: a successful gallery owner and a man with nothing but the clothes on his back. A marriage contract that started as pure business. But when two lonely people pretend to be in love, the pretending can become dangerously real. Charlotte thought she was saving Michael from the streets, but maybe he was the one saving her from a beautiful, empty existence. What happens when a fake marriage starts to feel more genuine than anything either of them has ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany grandfather clock in Charlotte Grant's office chimed 11 times, each note echoing through the pristine halls of the Grant Contemporary Gallery like a countdown to her doom. She stood before the massive oil portrait of her father, Harrison Grant, his stern blue eyes seeming to follow her every movement, even 6 months after his funeral. The painting dominated the wall behind her glass desk, a constant reminder of the empire he'd built from nothing and the impossible standards he'd set for his only daughter, Dot, at 34. Charlotte had everything most people dreamed of a thriving art gallery in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, and a trust fund that ensured she'd never want for anything material. Yet as she stared at her father's portrait, she felt the familiar weight of loneliness pressing down on her chest like a physical thing. The legal documents scattered across her desk told a story she was still struggling to accept: her father's will. All 47 pages of it contained a clause so archaic and cruel that she'd read it a dozen times, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something more palatable. The Grant family fortune, the gallery, the properties, everything would pass to distant cousins unless Charlotte married within 1 year of her father's death. Not engaged, married. "It's really quite straightforward, Miss Grant," her father's attorney, Harold Pemberton, had explained that morning with the detached professionalism that came from 40 years of delivering difficult news. "Your father was very specific about his intentions. He believed marriage would provide you with the stability and purpose he felt you lacked." Charlotte had wanted to laugh, or perhaps scream. Stability? Her gallery had been profitable for 7 consecutive years. Purpose? She'd discovered more emerging artists than any other dealer in the city. But Harrison Grant had never seen past her unmarried status to recognize her accomplishments. Even in death, he was trying to control her choices. The irony wasn't lost on her that she stood in a gallery surrounded by priceless works of art pieces that spoke of love, passion, heartbreak, and triumph, while her own life felt as sterile and carefully curated as the white walls around her. She'd dated, of course. There had been Richard, the investment banker who treated her like a merger opportunity. David, the artist, had been more interested in her connections than her heart. And Marcus, who'd made it clear that marrying Charlotte Grant would be excellent for his political aspirations. Each relationship had followed the same pattern: initial attraction, carefully orchestrated dates at the finest restaurants, introductions to society friends, and then the inevitable moment when she realized they saw her as Charlotte Grant, heiress and gallery owner, rather than simply Charlotte, a woman who collected vintage teacups and cried at romantic comedies, and sometimes felt so achingly lonely that she wondered if wealth was actually a curse disguised as a blessing. Her assistant, Maria, knocked softly on the office door. "Miss Grant, I'm heading home for the evening. Is there anything you need before I go?" Charlotte glanced at the clock again. 11:15. She'd been standing here for over an hour, lost in thought. "No, thank you, Maria. Have a good evening." "You should go home too," Maria said gently. At 58, she'd been with the gallery for 12 years, and had appointed herself Charlotte's unofficial guardian. "You've been working late every night." This week, Charlotte managed to smile. "Soon. I just want to finish reviewing the Berkshire acquisition." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The truth was that going home to her empty penthouse felt even more depressing than staying here among the paintings. At least here, surrounded by art, she could pretend she was keeping company with the souls of the artists who'd created these works. At home, there was only silence and the view of a city full of people living lives that seemed infinitely more meaningful than her own. After Maria left, Charlotte walked through the gallery's main floor, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floors. The space was beautiful soaring ceilings, perfectly positioned lighting, each piece given the respect and attention it deserved. This was her legacy, her life's work. And in 6 months, if she couldn't find a husband, it would all belong to her cousin Theodore, a man who'd once suggested she turn the gallery into a shopping mall. She paused before a painting she'd acquired just last month, a haunting piece by an emerging artist named Elena Vasquez. It depicted a woman sitting alone at a cafe, surrounded by couples and families, her face a study in quiet desperation, masked by social politeness. Charlotte had connected with it immediately, perhaps too immediately. The evening routine that had become her prison began as it always did. She checked the security system, turned off the lights in each room, and made her way to the back entrance, where her driver waited. But tonight, something was different. As she pushed open the heavy glass door that led to the alley behind the gallery, she nearly stumbled over a figure huddled against the brick wall. A man sat with his back against the building, wrapped in a threadbare coat that had seen better years. He looked up at her with startled eyes, intelligent gray-green eyes that seemed oddly familiar, though she was certain they'd never met. In his hands was a book, its pages yellowed and worn. Even in the dim light from the security lamp, she could make out the title, The Great Gatsby. "I'm sorry," he said, starting to gather his things. "I'll move along." Charlotte found herself rooted to the spot. She'd seen homeless people before. Of course, it was impossible to live in Manhattan and not encounter them. But she'd always hurried past, uncomfortable with her inability to solve such an enormous problem with her considerable resources. This time, something made her pause. "You don't have to move," she heard herself saying. "I was just leaving." The man looked up at her again, and she noticed that despite his circumstances, there was a dignity in his posture, a carefulness in the way he handled the book that spoke of someone who understood the value of things beyond their monetary worth. "Thank you," he said simply. Charlotte nodded and continued toward her waiting car, but she found herself glancing back. The man had returned to his reading, seemingly oblivious to the cold October wind that was picking up. As her driver pulled away from the curb, she watched him in the side mirror until he disappeared from view. That night, lying in her king-sized bed in her climate-controlled penthouse, Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about those gray-green eyes and the careful way the man had held his book. She'd spent the day drowning in her father's attempts to control her, life from beyond the grave, feeling helpless and trapped by circumstances beyond her control. But here was someone facing far greater challenges than a marriage deadline, and he'd been sitting there reading Fitzgerald as if he had all the time in the world. She pulled out her phone and found herself researching homeless services in the city, reading statistics that made her stomach churn. According to the most recent count, there were over 60,000 homeless individuals in New York City. 60,000 people like the man reading by her gallery, each with their own story, their own circumstances that had led them to the streets. Charlotte set down her phone and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would call Harold Pemberton and ask about the exact legal requirements for the marriage clause. There had to be loopholes, alternatives, ways around her father's archaic demands. But as sleep finally began to claim her, Her last conscious thought was of intelligent, gray-green eyes and the quiet dignity of a man who found solace in literature even when he had nowhere to call home. 3 days later, Charlotte found herself lingering by the gallery's back entrance far longer than necessary. She'd invented reasons to step outside checking for deliveries, inspecting the security lighting, ensuring the dumpster was properly positioned. But the truth was more complicated. The homeless man hadn't returned, and his absence bothered her more than it should have. When she finally spotted him on Thursday evening, sitting in the same spot with a different book, To Kill a Mockingbird, this time, she felt an unexpected rush of relief. This time, she was prepared. She'd stopped by a nearby cafe and purchased 2 cups of coffee and a sandwich, telling herself it was simply human decency. "Excuse me," she said, approaching carefully. "I brought coffee. If you'd like some—" The man looked up, and she saw surprise flicker across his weathered face. He was older than she'd initially thought, maybe late 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a week's worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that caught her attention again, the same intelligent gray-green that seemed to see more than most people. "That's very kind of you," he said, accepting the cup with hands that she noticed were clean despite his circumstances. "Thank you. I'm Charlotte," she said, settling on the concrete step beside him, her designer coat a stark contrast to his worn layers. "Michael," he replied. "Michael Chun." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both warming their hands on the coffee cups. Charlotte found herself studying his profile as he read, noting the way his lips moved slightly when he encountered a particularly beautiful passage. "Good book?" she asked. Michael smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "One of the best. I've read it probably a dozen times, but I always find something new." He paused, glancing at her. "You own the gallery, don't you? I've seen you leaving." Charlotte nodded. "For 7 years now." "Do you like art?" "I used to." There was something wistful in his voice. "I had a subscription to art news, spent weekends at museums." "Before?" He stopped himself, taking a sip of coffee. "Before what?" Michael was quiet for so long that Charlotte thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "Before my life fell apart." Charlotte wanted to ask more, but something in his expression warned her off. Instead, she said, "What did you do? Before, I mean." "I was a high school English teacher, had a small apartment in Brooklyn, a car that mostly ran, a girlfriend who talked about marriage." He gave a bitter laugh. "Funny how quickly everything can change. What happened?" Michael set down his coffee and looked at her directly. "My mother got sick. Alzheimer's. The insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. I took a second mortgage on the apartment, then a third. Used every credit card I could get. When she died, I had nothing left except debt and a broken heart." Charlotte felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry. The really stupid part is that I thought I was being responsible. Thought there were safety nets, systems in place. Turns out those systems work great if you're rich or if you're poor enough to qualify for assistance. But if you're middle class and you get hit with a catastrophic illness," he shrugged, "you fall through the cracks." The weight of his story settled between them. Charlotte thought about her own father's recent battle with cancer, the best doctors money could buy, experimental treatments, private nurses. She'd never had to choose between her father's care and her financial survival. "How long have you?" Then she paused, not sure how to phrase it delicately. "Homeless? 8 months." Michael's voice was matter-of-fact. "Lost the apartment first, then the car. Stayed with friends until I wore out my welcome. The shelter system is overcrowded. And frankly, the streets are sometimes safer." Charlotte stared at him, trying to reconcile this articulate, educated man with her preconceptions about homelessness. "Don't you have family? My mother was in." She emigrated from Taiwan in the 70s, worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school. She never remarried after my father died. I was her whole world, and she was mine. His voice softened. She would have hated knowing that taking care of her destroyed my life. They fell silent again. Charlotte found herself thinking about her own mother, who died when Charlotte was 12. Cancer, quick and merciless. But her father's wealth had ensured the best possible care, the most comfortable final month's money could buy. I should. Get going, Michael said, starting to pack up his book. Thank you for the coffee. You didn't have to. Wait, Charlotte said, the word bursting out before she could stop it. An idea was forming in her mind, crazy and impulsive and possibly brilliant. Can I ask you something? Michael paused, his book halfway into a worn backpack. Are you married? Engaged? In a relationship? If he thought the question was odd, he didn't show it. No. Hard to maintain a relationship when you don't have an address. Charlotte took a deep breath. What she was about to propose would sound insane to any rational person. But sitting here next to Michael, listening to his story, she realized that rational hadn't gotten her anywhere. Her father's marriage clause was irrational. Her loneliness was irrational. Maybe it was time to fight absurdity with absurdity. I have a proposition for you, she said, and I need you to hear me out before you say no. Michael's eyebrows rose. Okay, I need to get married. Not for love, not for romance, for purely legal reasons. My father's will requires it, or I lose everything. You need a place to live and a chance to rebuild your life. She paused, her heart pounding. What if we could help each other? Michael stared at her for a long moment. Are you proposing marriage to a homeless man you met 3 days ago? I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. You get housing, food, help getting back on your feet. I get to keep my father's legacy intact. 1 year, strictly business. You don't know anything about me. I know you read Harper Lee and F. Scott Fitzgerald. I know you sacrificed everything for your mother. I know you're educated, articulate, and despite everything you've been through, you still have your dignity. Charlotte surprised herself with the conviction in her voice. I know more about your character from 3 conversations than I learned about most men I dated for months. Michael shook his head slowly. Charlotte, you seem like a good person. But this is crazy. Marriage isn't something you enter into like a business contract, isn't it? Charlotte asked. My father certainly thought so. He's trying to force me into marriage from beyond the grave because he thinks I need a man to give my life meaning. Well, maybe I'll give him exactly what he asked for, just not the way he intended. What exactly are you proposing? Charlotte realized she was making this up as she went along, but the pieces were falling into place in her mind with startling clarity. A real marriage, legally speaking. You'd live in the guest house on my property, completely separate from my space. We'd appear together at social functions when necessary. In exchange, I'd help you get back on your feet. Job placement, new clothes, whatever you need to rebuild your life. And after a year, amicable divorce. You'd have a year of stability to figure out your next steps. Michael was quiet for a long time, studying her face as if trying to determine whether she was serious or suffering from some kind of breakdown. Finally, he said, Why me? You could marry anyone. Could I? Charlotte laughed, but there was no humor in it. I could marry someone who wants my money, or my connections, or the prestige of the grant name. I could marry someone who would spend the year trying to charm me into making the arrangement permanent, or worse, someone who would make my life miserable out of spite. She looked at him directly. But you're the first person I've met in years who doesn't want anything from me, except basic human kindness. That makes you the safest choice I could make. Michael set down his coffee cup and ran his hands through his hair. This is insane. Yes, Charlotte agreed. completely insane. But sometimes insane is the only rational response to an irrational situation. I need to think about it. Of course. Charlotte stood up, brushing off her coat. I'll be here tomorrow night. Same time. If you're interested, we can discuss details. If not, she shrugged. I'll keep buying you coffee until you find somewhere else to read. As she walked back to her car, Charlotte wondered if she'd finally lost her mind. But for the first time in months, she felt something other than despair about her father's impossible deadline. She felt hope that Michael was waiting for her the next evening. But this time, he was standing rather than sitting, a small duffel bag at his feet. Everything he owned in the world, Charlotte realized, fit into a bag smaller than her purse. I've been thinking about your offer, he said without preamble. Charlotte's heart started racing. And it's still insane, he said, but there was something different in his voice. But I've been homeless for 8 months, and in that time, exactly one person has treated me like a human being worth talking to. That person is you. So you'll do it? Michael nodded slowly. With conditions. Name them. First, I want this in writing. A contract that spells out exactly what we're both agreeing to. I won't be indebted to you, and I won't be your charity case. This is a business arrangement, period. Charlotte felt a surge of respect for him. Even in his desperation, he was protecting his dignity. Agreed. What else? I want to contribute something. I can't pay rent, but I can work. Maintenance, security, whatever you need around the gallery or your property. You don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was firm. I need to earn my place, not just be given it. Charlotte studied his face, seeing the pride beneath the practicality. This man had been broken by circumstances, but he hadn't been defeated. All right, what else? No one can know the real reason we're married. As far as the world is concerned, this is a love story. Why does that matter? Michael shouldered his bag. Because I won't be pitied, and I won't have people thinking you married me out of some misguided sense of charity. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. That night, Charlotte called her lawyer and had him draft a marriage contract that would have made her father roll over in his grave. It outlined financial arrangements, living situations, and expectations with the cold precision of a business merger. Harold Pemberton thought she'd lost her mind. Miss Grant, I must advise against this course of action. You know nothing about this man's background, his mental health, his potential criminal history. Then run a background check. Charlotte interrupted. I want to know everything about Michael Chun. Education, employment history, credit report, criminal record, if he has one. Everything. The report came back 3 days later. Michael had been exactly who he said he was, a high school English teacher at a respected Brooklyn school for 9 years before his resignation 8 months ago. No criminal record, no history of mental illness, no red flags except for the catastrophic medical debt that had destroyed his financial life. What the report couldn't capture was the man she'd been getting to know over coffee and conversation each evening. Michael read voraciously, had opinions about everything from contemporary art to city politics, and possessed a dry humor that caught her off guard. He was also stubborn, proud to a fault, and had a tendency to disappear into his own thoughts at unexpected moments. Ready to take the plunge? Charlotte asked on the evening before their planned trip to City Hall. Michael looked up from the contract he'd been reading for the 3rd time. Are you sure about the living arrangements? The guest house is awfully close to your home. Charlotte's property in Greenwich Village included a main house and a small guest cottage connected by a garden. Courtyard. It was intimate without being intrusive, close enough for their charade to be believable, but separate enough to maintain privacy. It's perfect for what we need, she said. Close enough that neighbors will see you coming and going. Far enough that we won't be living in each other's pockets. And your friends? How are you going to explain this? Charlotte had been dreading this conversation. Her social circle was small but tight-knit gallery owners, collectors, artists, and society figures who had known her for years. The idea of suddenly producing a husband would require careful handling. "I'll tell them we met through the gallery, that you're an art history professor taking a sabbatical." It wasn't entirely a lie. Michael did have a master's degree in English literature, and he knew more about art than most people she dated. "We'll say we've been seeing each other quietly for a few months. What about your family?" "There is no family. Just some distant cousins who were probably already planning what to do with the gallery when they inherit it." Michael signed the contract with a pen that cost more than he'd spent on food in the past month. His signature was careful, precise, the handwriting of someone who'd spent years grading papers and writing lesson plans. "This feels like I'm signing my soul away," he said. "No," Charlotte replied, signing her own name with a flourish. "You're signing it back." The next morning, they met at City Hall dressed like two people heading to completely different events. Charlotte wore a simple but elegant navy dress that probably cost more than Michael's entire wardrobe. Michael wore the only clean shirt he owned and pants Charlotte had quietly purchased for him, claiming they were part of the wardrobe budget outlined in their contract. The ceremony was perfunctory, clinical, a far cry from the fairy tale wedding Charlotte had dreamed of as a little girl. Judge Martinez read the standard vows in a bored voice while two clerks served as witnesses. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Michael leaned in for the obligatory kiss with the awkwardness of two actors performing a scene they hadn't properly rehearsed. "Congratulations," Judge Martinez said, handing them their marriage certificate. Next, standing on the courthouse steps afterward, Charlotte felt the surreal weight of what they'd just done. She was married to a man she'd known for 2 weeks, a man who was now looking at their marriage certificate like it might burst into flames. "Having second thoughts?" she asked. "Third and fourth thoughts," Michael admitted, "but it's done now." They drove to Charlotte's house in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the arrangement they'd just made legal. The house was a restored 19th century brownstone that had belonged to Charlotte's grandmother's warm brick facade, ivy-covered walls, and enough space for a dozen people to live comfortably. Michael stood in the entrance hall, taking in the art-covered walls, the antique furniture, the fresh flowers that Maria arranged twice weekly. "This is your home?" "Our home," Charlotte corrected. "For the next year, anyway." She led him through the garden to the guest house, a converted carriage house that had been renovated into a comfortable studio apartment. It had its own entrance, a small kitchen, and windows that overlooked the garden. "It's perfect," Michael said quietly, setting his bag on the bed, the first real bed he'd slept in since becoming homeless. "There are clothes in the closet," Charlotte said. "Basic things. We can go shopping for more when you're ready." Michael opened the closet to find shirts, pants, shoes, a complete wardrobe in his size. "How did you—" "I'm good at logistics," Charlotte said. "It's part of running a business." But there was something else in the closet that made Michael stop short. Books, dozens of them, arranged carefully on built-in shelves. Classic literature, contemporary fiction, poetry, art history texts. "I thought you might be missing them," Charlotte said softly. Michael ran his finger along the spines, his expression unreadable. "Thank you." "Michael," Charlotte said, suddenly feeling the weight of what they'd undertaken. "I know this is strange and complicated, but I want you to. No, you're safe here. Whatever happens, you're safe." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment the careful walls they both constructed seemed to thin. "So are you," he said. Their first week as a married couple was an exercise in careful choreography. Charlotte left for the gallery each morning at 8, and Michael emerged from the guest house an hour later to begin what he insisted on calling his employment duties. These included maintaining the garden, checking the security system, and handling small repairs around the property. Charlotte returned each evening to find some small improvement. Loose hinges tightened, flower beds weeded, light bulbs replaced. In fixtures she hadn't even noticed were dim. Michael worked with the methodical care of someone who took pride in doing things properly, no matter how small the task. Their interactions were polite, almost formal. They shared coffee in the garden each morning before Charlotte left for work, discussing the weather, current events, anything that didn't venture into personal territory. In the evenings, they sometimes ate dinner together on the patio, conversations flowing more easily as they discovered shared interests in literature and art. "You have a Rothko," Michael said on their fifth evening, looking through the windows of Charlotte's living room from his seat at the outdoor table. "A small one. My father bought it as an investment piece." Charlotte followed his gaze. "Do you like it?" "I remember seeing a Rothko exhibition at MoMA years ago. Stood in front of one painting for an hour, just watching how the colors seemed to breathe." He paused. "I thought the security guard was going to ask me to move along, but he just nodded like he understood." "What did you see in it?" Michael considered the question seriously. "Longing, maybe, or hope. It's hard to explain. The colors seemed to vibrate with something just beyond words." Charlotte found herself studying his profile as he spoke. When Michael talked about art or literature, his entire demeanor changed. The careful walls came down, and she glimpsed the teacher he'd been. The passion that had once filled classrooms with students eager to understand the world through his eyes. "Would you like to see it up close?" she heard herself asking. Michael looked surprised. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. You live here now." Leading him through her living room felt strangely intimate. This was her private space, filled with personal treasures and family photographs. Books she'd read and reread. Comfortable furniture chosen for pleasure rather than appearance. Michael moved through it with the respectful attention of someone visiting a museum, pausing to study pieces without touching anything. The Rothko hung in a place of honor. Above the fireplace, deep reds and oranges that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Michael stood before it in the same reverent silence Charlotte remembered from her own first encounter with the piece. "It's magnificent," he said finally. "My father never understood why I loved it. He saw it as an investment, nothing more." Charlotte moved to stand beside him. "But I think you're right about the longing. Sometimes I look at it and feel like it understands something about life that I'm still trying to figure out." "Art has a way of reflecting our emotions back to us," Michael said. "That's what I used to tell my students. A great painting doesn't just show you what the artist was feeling. It shows you what you're feeling." "What do you miss most about teaching?" The question slipped out before Charlotte could stop it. Too personal for their carefully maintained boundaries. But Michael didn't seem to mind. "The moment when a student finally gets it," he said. "When they stop seeing literature as something they have to endure and start seeing it as something that speaks to them." "I had a kid once, tough kid from a rough neighborhood, who swore poetry was stupid. Then we rigged Langston Hughes, and something clicked. He started writing his own poems, good ones. Last I heard, he was in college on a scholarship. That must have been incredibly rewarding." "It was everything," Michael said quietly. "I know it sounds dramatic, but those kids were my purpose. Knowing I was making a difference, however small, it made everything else worth it." Charlotte heard the pain beneath his words and felt a sudden fierce anger at the circumstances that had stolen that purpose from him. "You could teach again. When this year is over, when you're back on your feet, maybe." But his voice suggested he didn't quite believe it. They fell into a comfortable routine over the following days. Charlotte began leaving books for Michael art, catalogs from upcoming exhibitions, novels she thought he'd enjoy, poetry collections that reminded her of their conversations. Michael responded by leaving thoughtful notes about the pieces. Observations that often made Charlotte see familiar works with fresh eyes. "I've been thinking about the Morrison piece in your bedroom." He wrote about a small, abstract painting that hung above her dresser. "The brushstrokes remind me of handwriting urgent, like someone trying to capture a thought before it disappears." Charlotte had owned that painting for 3 years and had never noticed the handwriting quality of the brushstrokes. Michael's observation transformed it for her, made it feel newly discovered. Their public debut as a couple came sooner than expected. Maria mentioned that Charlotte had seemed happier lately, and when pressed, Charlotte found herself explaining about her new relationship with more detail than their cover story strictly required. "You have to bring him to the Hartley opening," Maria insisted. "Everyone's been wondering why you've been so secretive about your personal life." The Hartley opening was a major event, the gallery's biggest exhibition of the year, featuring a renowned sculptor whose work commanded 6-figure prices. Charlotte had been planning it for months, and it would be attended by everyone who mattered in the city's art world. "I don't know if Michael's ready for that kind of spotlight," Charlotte told Maria, but she was really thinking about whether she was ready to present their arrangement to people who knew her well enough to spot inconsistencies. That evening, she broached the subject over dinner in the garden. "We need to make our first public appearance," she said. "Gallery opening next week. It's important." Michael set down his fork. "How public are we talking?" "Very. Art collectors, critics, society people. Everyone I know professionally will be there, and they'll expect to see us acting like a married couple." "Yes." Michael was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. What does that look like, exactly? Charlotte realized she'd been avoiding thinking about the physical aspects of their charade. Standing close together, casual touches, the small intimacies that marked a real relationship. "We'll need to be comfortable with each other," she said carefully. "Hand-holding, maybe an arm around the waist. Nothing dramatic, just connected." "We should practice," Michael said, his practical nature asserting itself. "If we're going to be convincing, we can't look like strangers pretending to be married." The idea of practicing intimacy with Michael made Charlotte's stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness about their arrangement and everything to do with the growing awareness that her fake husband was becoming less fake and more simply husband in her daily thoughts. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll start tomorrow." The practicing started awkwardly. Charlotte stood in her living room the next evening, feeling ridiculous as she and Michael attempted to master the art of looking naturally affectionate. Their first attempts at hand-holding felt like a business handshake, stiff and formal. "We look like we're about to negotiate a merger," Charlotte said, laughing despite her nervousness. "Maybe we should think of it differently," Michael suggested. "What did your parents look like together? How did they move as a couple?" Charlotte's smile faded. "I don't remember much. My mother died when I was 12, and my father never remarried. Not exactly a model for marital bliss. I'm sorry. I didn't think. It's fine." Charlotte waved off his apology. "What about your parents?" "My father died when I was young, but I remember how my mother talked about him. The way her face would soften when she shared stories about their early days together." Michael's expression grew thoughtful. "She said he used to trace patterns on her palm when they talked, like he was reading her future there." Without thinking, Michael reached for Charlotte's hand and began drawing invisible designs across her palm with his fingertip. The touch was gentle, absent-minded, and it sent an unexpected shiver up Charlotte's arm. "Like that?" he asked, not noticing her reaction. "Yes," Charlotte managed, surprised by how breathless she sounded. That's perfect." They practiced for an hour, learning the choreography of coupledom. Michael's hand at the small of Charlotte's back as they walked across the room. Charlotte's fingers straightening his collar with the casual intimacy of someone who had the right to touch him. Gradually, the movements began to feel less rehearsed, more natural. "You're a good student," Charlotte said as they wrapped up their session. "You're a good teacher," Michael replied. "Though I have to say, this is the strangest lesson plan I've ever encountered." The night of the Hartley opening arrived with unseasonable warmth for October. Charlotte spent longer than usual getting ready, trying on 3 different dresses before settling on a midnight blue silk that made her feel confident without being ostentatious. When she emerged from her bedroom, she found Michael waiting in the living room, and her breath caught. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, one of the pieces she'd had delivered while he was out walking in the neighborhood. But it wasn't just the clothes that transformed him. Standing in her elegant living room, Michael looked like he belonged there. The careful posture of someone accustomed to being invisible had been replaced by the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "You look beautiful," he said, and something in his voice made her think he meant it as more than part of their performance. "You clean up pretty well yourself," she replied, fighting the urge to reach out and touch his face. "Ready for this?" "As ready as anyone can be for their debut as a fake husband." The gallery was already crowded when they arrived. Charlotte moved through the space with practiced ease, greeting collectors and critics, discussing the sculptural pieces with the expertise that had built her reputation. Michael stayed close, playing his part perfectly. The devoted husband who was genuinely interested in his wife's work, but didn't need to be the center of attention. "Charlotte, darling." Vivian Hartwell, one of Charlotte's oldest clients, swept over in a cloud of expensive perfume and curiosity. "You must introduce me to your husband. We've all been dying to meet the man who finally captured your heart." "Vivian, this is Michael," Charlotte said, slipping her arm through his with what she hoped looked like natural affection. "Michael, Vivian Hartwell. She has one of the most impressive contemporary collections in the city." Michael extended his hand with easy charm. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hartwell. Charlotte has told me wonderful things about your collection. Please, call me Vivian. And I must say, you're even more handsome than Charlotte described." Vivian's eyes sparkled with the delight of someone who loved being in on secrets. "How did you two meet?" Charlotte felt Michael's subtle tension. They'd prepared for this question, but theory was different from practice under Vivian's penetrating gaze. "Through the gallery, actually," Michael said smoothly. "I was researching a paper on post-war American sculpture, and Charlotte was kind enough to let me study some pieces in her collection." "How romantic. Love blooming among the art." Vivian clasped their hands together. "And what do you think of tonight's exhibition?" Michael glanced around the room with genuine appreciation. "Hartley's work has this wonderful tension between brutality and beauty. The way he uses rust and patina, it's like he's letting time collaborate with him in the creative process." Vivian blinked in surprise. "That's remarkably perceptive. Are you an art critic?" "English professor, actually, on sabbatical." Michael's smile was self-deprecating. "But Charlotte has been educating me about the visual arts. I'm discovering that literature and sculpture have more in common than I initially thought." "How fascinating. You must tell me more." "Vivian." Charlotte's assistant Maria appeared at her elbow. "The Times reviewer is here, and he's asking about the pricing on the large bronze piece." As Vivian was drawn away, Charlotte felt Michael relax slightly beside her. "Nice recovery," she murmured. "She's terrifying," he whispered back. "Do all your friends interrogate like that?" "Only the ones who care about me. And Vivian definitely cares. She's been trying to set me up with her nephew for 3 years." They moved through the crowd, and Charlotte found herself genuinely enjoying the evening in a way she hadn't expected. Michael was a natural at these events, engaging enough to be charming, but deferential enough not to upstage her. He asked thoughtful questions about the artwork and listened to responses with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in learning. But it was the small moments that felt most real. The way he steadied her when she stumbled slightly in her heels. the protective way he guided her through dense crowds, the proud smile he wore when he watched her discuss a complex piece with a potential buyer. "You're good at this," she said during a quiet moment when they'd stepped outside. "For air. At what? Pretending to be married to you?" "At being my partner. Even if it's just for show." Michael studied her face in the soft lighting from the gallery windows. "Maybe it doesn't have to be entirely for show." Before Charlotte could ask what he meant, they were interrupted by a commotion inside. Through the windows, they could see a woman gesticulating wildly near one of the sculptures, her voice carrying over the ambient noise of the party. "Absolutely ridiculous prices for what amounts to scrap metal. In my day, art meant something," Charlotte sighed. "Mrs. Pemberton, Harold's wife. She comes to every opening and complains about everything." "The lawyer's wife?" "The same. She thinks contemporary art is a conspiracy to separate rich people from their money." Charlotte started back toward the door. "I should handle this before she scares off actual buyers." But as they approached Mrs. Pemberton, the elderly woman's complaints took a more personal turn. "And don't get me started on this sudden marriage business," she was saying to a small cluster of uncomfortable-looking guests. "Mark my words, there's something fishy about the whole thing. Harold told me about that ridiculous clause in Harrison's will, and now suddenly Charlotte produces a husband out of thin air? The timing is awfully convenient, if you ask me." Charlotte felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. She'd known there would be speculation, but she hadn't expected it to be quite so public or quite so pointed. Michael's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Deep breath," he murmured. "We knew this might happen." "Did we know it would happen in front of half the art world?" "Mrs. Pemberton," Charlotte said, approaching the group with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I hope you're enjoying the exhibition." The older woman had the grace to look slightly embarrassed at being overheard, but she rallied quickly. "Charlotte, dear, we were just discussing your surprise announcement." "I can imagine." Charlotte's voice was carefully controlled. "I'd like you to meet my husband, Michael Chun. Michael, this is Mrs. Pemberton." Michael stepped forward with easy confidence, but Charlotte could feel the tension radiating from him. "Mrs. Pemberton, what a pleasure. Charlotte has told me so much about you and your husband." "I'm sure she has." Mrs. Pemberton's smile was sharp. "Tell me, Mr. Chun, what is it you do?" "I'm an educator. Currently on sabbatical while I help Charlotte with some research projects." "How convenient. And how long have you two been acquainted?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but Michael beat her to it. "Long enough to know that I'm the luckiest man in this room," he said, turning to look at Charlotte with an expression so tender and genuine that she almost forgot they were acting. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for someone who understands them completely. I was fortunate enough to find that person in Charlotte." The small crowd around them seemed to collectively exhale, the romantic declaration diffusing the tension of Mrs. Pemberton's implied accusations. Even the elderly woman looked slightly mollified. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, that's very sweet." But as the group dispersed and the evening wound down, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that they'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. Mrs. Pemberton's suspicions weren't going away, and there would be others who questioned the convenience of their timing. Later, as they rode home in comfortable silence, Michael finally spoke. "She's not wrong, you know?" "About the timing." Charlotte looked at him in surprise. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No, but she's going to be watching us, looking for cracks in our story. We need to be prepared for that." Charlotte nodded, but her mind was still caught on the moment when he'd called her the person who understood him completely. For just a few seconds, standing in her gallery surrounded by beautiful art and the warm glow of the opening, it had felt completely true. The scrutiny began almost immediately. Over the next few weeks, Charlotte noticed the subtle signs, friends asking pointed questions about her relationship history with Michael, unexpected visits from acquaintances who'd never shown much interest in her personal life, and a general sense that people were watching, waiting for something to slip. The pressure affected them both differently. Charlotte became hyper-aware of their public interactions, second-guessing every gesture and word. Michael retreated slightly, spending more time in the guest house and less time in the shared spaces of their arrangement. "You're avoiding me," Charlotte said one evening, finding him reading in the garden under the soft glow of the outdoor lights. Michael looked up from his book, Neruda's poetry. She noticed, "I'm giving you space. This arrangement is harder on you than I expected it to be." "What do you mean?" The questioning, the suspicion. "You didn't sign up for having your character questioned by people who've known you for years." Charlotte sat down beside him on the garden bench, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of the soap he used, something simple and clean that reminded her of rain. "Is that what you think? That I regret this? Don't you?" The question hung between them in the cooling evening air. Charlotte found herself thinking about the past month, the morning coffees that had become the highlight of her day, the comfortable silences as they worked in different parts of the garden, the way Michael's presence had transformed her house from a showcase into something that felt like a home. "No," she said quietly. "I don't regret it, but I think you might." Michael closed his book, marking his place with a careful finger. "Why would you think that?" "Because you're disappearing." Again, not physically, but she struggled to find the words. "When we first started this, you were so present, so engaged. Now it feels like you're putting walls back up. Maybe because I'm starting to forget this isn't real." The admission hung between them like a confession. Charlotte felt her heart do something complicated in her chest, a flutter that was part fear, part hope. Would that be such a terrible thing? She heard herself asking. Michael turned to look at her, his gray-green eyes serious in the lamplight. "Charlotte, what we have, it's built on necessity, not choice. You needed a husband to keep your inheritance. I needed a place to rebuild my life. That's not exactly the foundation for something lasting. But what if it could be?" "What if what? Could be?" Charlotte took a breath, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff. "What if we stopped pretending this was just a business arrangement? What if we admitted that somewhere along the way, it became something else?" Michael was quiet for so long that Charlotte began to regret her words. Then he said, "You don't know me well enough to want something real. I know you read poetry in the garden at night. I know you fix things without being asked because you need to feel useful. I know you remember everything I tell you about the artists I work with, and you ask thoughtful questions that show you're actually listening." Charlotte's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I know you're kind to Maria even when she fuses over you, and you're patient with Mrs. Pemberton even when she's being awful. I know you think before you speak, and when you do speak, it's usually worth hearing. Those are surface things." "No, they're not." Charlotte shifted to face him fully. "Those are the things that matter. Character things. The big dramatic gestures and passionate declarations. Those are easy. It's the daily kindnesses that reveal who someone really is." Michael studied her face as if trying to determine whether she meant what she was saying. "Charlotte, I have nothing to offer you. No career, no money, no prospects beyond what you're giving me. You have yourself. And for the first time in my adult life, that feels like enough." The words surprised Charlotte, even as she spoke them. She'd spent so many years dating men who looked good on paper, successful, established, socially appropriate, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to simply enjoy someone's company without calculating their value as a potential partner. "This is dangerous territory," Michael said softly. "I know. If we cross this line, there's no going back to the simple business arrangement. I know that too." Michael reached out and traced the pattern he'd been practicing on her palm, But this time it didn't feel like rehearsal. It felt like a choice. "I need you to be sure," he said, "because I've been falling for you since the second week we've been living here. And if you're not serious about this, if you're just feeling lonely or grateful or sorry for me, it's going to destroy me." Charlotte felt her breath catch. "You've been falling for me?" Completely, helplessly, against all common sense and self-preservation. Michael's smile was rueful. "Did you think I practiced those touches with you every night just for the sake of authenticity? Did you think I memorized your coffee order and your favorite books and the way you laugh when you're surprised because I'm a dedicated method actor? I thought—" Charlotte stopped, realizing she'd been afraid to think too much about Michael's motivations because she'd been afraid to examine her own. "I thought you were just being kind." "I was being kind, but I was also being selfish. Every morning when I brought you coffee, every evening when we talked about art or books or nothing at all, I was storing up memories, building something to hold on to when this year was over and you moved on to your real life." Charlotte felt tears pricking at her eyes. What if I don't want to move on? What if you do? What if this feeling is just novelty or relief at not having to face the marriage deadline alone? What if in 6 months you wake up and realize you've tied yourself to someone who can't give you the life you deserve? And what if in 6 months I wake up and realize I've found the person I want to build a life with? Michael's hand stilled on her palm. "Charlotte, I'm scared too," she said. "I'm terrified that I'm confusing gratitude with something deeper, or that I'm projecting some kind of rescue fantasy onto this situation. But I'm more terrified of pretending I don't feel what I feel because it's inconvenient or complicated." "What do you feel?" The question was simple, but Charlotte realized the answer was anything but. What did she feel for this man who read poetry in her garden and fixed broken things without being asked? What did she feel for someone who'd lost everything but still maintained his dignity and kindness? "Safe," she said finally. "For the first time in my adult life, I feel completely safe with another person. Not because you can protect me from external threats, but because I trust you not to hurt me deliberately. I trust your intentions, your character, your—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Your heart." Michael leaned closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "You realize we're probably both making a terrible mistake." "Probably," Charlotte agreed, leaning into his touch. "Our timing is awful. Our circumstances are complicated, and we're going to have to figure out how to navigate this transition in the middle of maintaining our public charade." "Definitely. And I'm still technically homeless, unemployed, and emotionally damaged from the last 2 years of my life. I'm still controlling, privileged, and carrying around daddy issues that probably require therapy." Michael laughed softly. "We're a mess. A beautiful mess," Charlotte corrected. "Are we really doing this?" Instead of answering with words, Charlotte leaned forward and kissed him. It was nothing like their practice kisses for public consumption, tentative, careful, designed for show. This kiss was real, full of questions and answers and possibilities that neither of them had dared to voice before this moment. When they finally broke apart, Michael rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything," he said. "I hope so," Charlotte whispered back. 3 weeks after their conversation in the garden, Charlotte was reviewing contracts in her office when Maria knocked on the door, with an expression that immediately set off alarm bells. "Miss Grant, there's a man here to see you. Says he's a private investigator." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "Did he say what this is about?" "Your father's estate." The investigator, a thin man in his 50s named Raymond Walsh, settled into the chair across from Charlotte's desk with the comfortable confidence of someone who delivered unwelcome news for a living. He opened a folder and spread several photographs across her desk, pictures of her and Michael at various locations around the city, time-stamped and clearly taken without their knowledge. "Mrs. Chun," he said, and Charlotte noticed the slight Emphasis he placed on her married name. "I've been hired by your father's estate to investigate the circumstances of your recent marriage." "By whom, exactly? I'm not at liberty to say. But I think you can guess." Charlotte could indeed guess. Theodore, her cousin, who stood to inherit everything if her marriage was deemed invalid. She'd underestimated his ambition and his willingness to fight for what he saw as his rightful inheritance. "What exactly are you investigating?" Walsh leaned back in his chair. "The timing of your marriage is quite convenient, wouldn't you say? Your father's will required marriage within 1 year of his death. You remained single for 11 months, then suddenly married a homeless man you'd known for 2 weeks. I fail to see how the length of our courtship is relevant to the validity of our marriage. Perhaps not legally, but it raises questions about the authenticity of the relationship." Walsh tapped one of the photographs. "This was taken at your gallery opening 3 weeks ago. You and your husband certainly look like a loving couple." Charlotte studied the image, she and Michael standing close together, his hand on her back, both of them smiling. It was a good picture, natural and warm, and it made her stomach churn to see their private moment captured and scrutinized. "Again, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Chun. I'm investigating whether your marriage is legitimate or whether it's a sham designed to circumvent your father's will. And how exactly do you plan to prove or disprove the legitimacy of someone's marriage?" Walsh smiled thinly. "There are ways. Financial records, living arrangements, witness interviews. I'm particularly interested in speaking with your husband about his background." Charlotte felt panic rising in her chest. Michael's story would hold up under scrutiny. It was all true, but the investigation itself would be humiliating for him. The thought of this man digging into Michael's medical debt, his mother's illness, his months on the street, made her feel sick with protective rage. "You have no legal right to harass my husband. I have every right to investigate potential fraud." Walsh gathered his photographs with deliberate care. "I'll be in touch, Mrs. Chen. I suggest you and your husband make yourselves available for questioning." After Walsh left, Charlotte sat in her office staring at the space where the photographs had been, trying to process what had just happened. Their careful charade was under attack, and worse, their relationship newly fragile and still finding its footing would now be subjected to the kind of scrutiny that could destroy it. Before it had a chance to grow dot, she called Michael immediately. "We have a problem," she said when he answered. "A big one." An hour later, they sat in Charlotte's living room while she recounted every detail of Walsh's visit. Michael listened without interruption, his expression growing more grim with each revelation. "So they're investigating whether our marriage is real," he said when she finished. "Yes, and if they determine it's not, I lose everything. The gallery, the house, the trust fund. All of it goes to Theodore." Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. What evidence would they need to prove the marriage is fake? "I don't know." Walsh wasn't specific about their methods. Charlotte felt tears of frustration threatening. "But Michael, if they start digging into your background, interviewing people who knew you before, they'll find out I was homeless when we met. And they'll paint this whole thing as a transaction. A desperate woman buying herself a husband to satisfy her father's will. Isn't that exactly what it was?" Michael's voice was quiet, but Charlotte heard the pain beneath it. "No, I mean, yes, it started that way, but what?" "Charlotte, everything they're going to uncover is true. You did offer marriage to a homeless man you barely knew. I did accept because I needed a place to live. Those are facts." Charlotte stared at him, seeing the walls going back up in real time. "Those are facts about how we started, not about what we've become. What we've become might not matter if we can't prove what we are now. And what are we now?" Michael looked at her for a long moment, and Charlotte saw the struggle playing out. On his face, the desire to fight. for what they'd found together, warring with his practical understanding of the situation they were in. "I don't know," he said finally. "3 weeks ago, I thought I did. But now, Charlotte, if this investigation destroys your life, if you lose everything because you took a chance on me, that's not your fault, isn't it? You could have found someone else. Someone with credentials and a background that wouldn't raise questions. Instead, you chose me, and now that choice might cost you everything your father built." Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest, not at Michael, but at the situation, at her father's manipulative will, at Theodore's greed, at a system that reduced their relationship to evidence and depositions. "So what are you saying? That we should just give up?" "I'm saying maybe you should consider cutting your losses." "By divorcing you? By letting me disappear? Tell them the marriage fell apart, that I left. You can remarry someone more suitable, someone who can pass their investigation." Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. "You want to run away? I want to protect you. By abandoning me when things get difficult? By not being the reason you lose everything?" They were both standing now, facing each other across the living room like adversaries rather than partners. Charlotte felt the careful foundation they'd built over the past months cracking beneath the pressure of external threat. "Michael, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I don't care about the money. I don't care about the gallery or the house or any of it if it means losing you. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. For the first time in my adult life, I found someone who sees me as more than a trust fund with legs. Someone who makes me laugh and challenges me and makes me want to be better than I am. You think I'm going to give that up because some private investigator is taking pictures? Charlotte, be realistic. How are we going to prove this marriage is real when it started as a business transaction? The same way any couple proves they're in love. By being in love." Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as his way of processing stress. "And if that's not enough, if they decide our story doesn't add up, then we fight. We get lawyers. We challenge their investigation. We make them prove their case in court if necessary. You're talking about a legal battle that could drag on for years. Against your own family. Theodore isn't my family. You are." The words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight that surprised them both. Charlotte realized she meant it, completely somewhere in the past few months. Michael had become the person she turned to, the one whose opinion mattered, the one whose well-being she considered before her own. "You don't mean that," Michael said quietly. "Yes, I do. And the fact that you can't see it, that you're ready to run at the first sign of trouble. Maybe I was wrong about what we've built here. Charlotte, no, I get it. This was always temporary for you. A year-long detour on your way back to your real life. Well, congratulations. You've got your out." Charlotte turned and walked toward the door, needing space to think, to breathe, to figure out how to fight a battle that felt suddenly much larger than proving the validity of their marriage. "Where are you going?" Michael called after her. "To call my lawyer," she said without turning around. "If you're not going to fight for this, then I'll fight for it alone." But as she closed the door behind her, Charlotte wondered if what she was fighting for even existed anymore, or if Walsh's investigation had already accomplished what it set out to do: destroy the trust that had taken months to build. The next morning, Charlotte sat in Harold Pemberton's office, surrounded by legal documents and growing despair. Her father's longtime attorney looked older than his 72 years as he reviewed Walsh's preliminary report, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "I won't lie to you, Charlotte. This doesn't look good." Harold removed his reading glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. "The timing alone raises questions, and this investigator has been thorough. Bank records showing no shared finances, witness statements about the speed of your courtship, photographs suggesting a business relationship rather than a romantic one. What photographs? Charlotte demanded. Harold turned his computer screen toward her. The images made her stomach clench. She and Michael maintained careful distance at public events, their body language formal and restrained. Walsh had deliberately chosen pictures from their early public appearances before they'd learned to look naturally affectionate. These were taken at the Morrison Gallery opening 6 weeks ago, Harold explained. See how you're standing? Like business associates, not newlyweds. Charlotte stared at the evidence of their careful performance, remembering how nervous they'd both been that night, how they'd practiced every gesture beforehand. The irony was bitter. Their efforts to appear authentic had created evidence of their inauthenticity. Harold, what are our options? Limited. The investigation is legal, and Theodore has standing to challenge the will if he can prove fraud. Our best defense is to demonstrate that your marriage has evolved into something genuine. How do we do that? Witness testimony about the change in your relationship, financial integration, evidence of cohabitation and shared domestic life. Harold paused. Charlotte, I have to ask, is your marriage genuine now, regardless of how it started? Charlotte thought about the past weeks, the easy conversations over morning coffee, the way Michael had started leaving small gifts for her, a perfect apple from the farmer's market, a book of poems he thought she'd enjoy, the gradual shift from separate lives to intertwined existence. Yes, she said without hesitation. It's real. Can you prove it? That was the question that haunted Charlotte as she drove home. How do you prove love? How do you document the moment when pretense becomes reality, when protection becomes partnership, when convenience becomes caring? She found Michael in the garden, tending to the rosebush with the methodical attention he brought to everything. He looked up when she approached, and she saw the careful distance in his expression that had become familiar over the past 24 hours. How did it go with the lawyer? He asked. Not well. They have pictures, witnesses, financial records. Everything suggests our marriage is exactly what it appears to be, a business arrangement. Michael nodded as if he'd expected this. So what happens now? Now we prove them wrong. Charlotte, no. Listen to me. She sat down on the garden bench where they'd had their first real conversation just weeks ago. Harold says our best defense is showing that our marriage has become genuine. That means we need evidence of a real relationship. What kind of evidence? Shared finances, joint decisions, witnesses who can testify that we've changed, that we're actually building a life together. Michael continued pruning the roses, not meeting her eyes. And if we can't convince them, then I lose everything. Charlotte's voice was matter-of-fact. But Michael, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this to save my inheritance. I'm doing this to save us. Us? What? We've built here. What we could still build if we're brave enough to fight for it. Michael finally looked at her, and she saw pain in his gray-green eyes. Charlotte, what if fighting makes everything worse? What if this investigation destroys whatever chance we had at something real? And what if not fighting means we never find out what we could have been? They stared at each other across the small distance that felt like a chasm. Charlotte realized they were at a crossroads. They could retreat to their safe, contractual arrangement and try to weather the investigation. Or they could commit fully to the relationship they'd been building and face whatever consequences came. I found something, Michael said suddenly. When I was cleaning out my storage unit last week, he disappeared into the guest house and returned with a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a ring, simple, elegant, with a small diamond that caught the afternoon light. It was my mother's engagement ring, he said. The only thing of value I managed to keep through everything. Charlotte stared at the ring, understanding the significance of what he was showing her. Michael, I want you to have it. Not for the investigation, not for show, because He stopped, struggling with words. Because when I think about my future now, you're in it. All of it. The good parts and the scary parts and the parts I haven't figured out yet. Charlotte felt tears blurring her vision. Are you proposing to me? I'm proposing that we stop pretending this is pretend. Michael took her hand, not to practice touches for public consumption, but with the trembling seriousness of someone making a real commitment. I'm proposing that we tell the truth to the investigators, to ourselves, to anyone who asks. That we started as strangers making a deal, but we're not strangers anymore. What are we? Partners. Real ones. In business and life and whatever comes next. Charlotte looked down at the ring in his palm. Not expensive by the standards she was accustomed to, but priceless in terms of what it represented. Michael's history, his mother's love story, his willingness to trust Charlotte with something irreplaceable. There's something I need to show you too, she said. She led him into the house, to her father's study where she'd found the original marriage clause that had started this whole arrangement. But behind his desk, in a safe she rarely opened, were other documents, papers she'd discovered just days after her father's funeral, but had never shared with anyone. These are my parents' love letters, she said, pulling out a bundle of envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. I found them after my father died, along with this. She handed Michael a legal document, her mother's will, written shortly before her death. In it, Elizabeth Grant had left everything to her husband with one specific provision. If their daughter remained unmarried by age 35, Charlotte would inherit the family art collection directly, bypassing any marriage requirements. Your mother left you an out, Michael said, reading the document. She did, but my father chose not to honor it. He buried this provision and created his own marriage clause instead. Charlotte's voice grew bitter. He was so determined to control my life that he ignored my mother's final wishes. Does this change anything legally? Harold thinks it might. If we can prove my father deliberately contradicted my mother's will, Theodore's case becomes much weaker. Charlotte paused. But that's not why I'm showing you this. Then why? Because my mother wrote something else. Charlotte opened one. Of the letters, her mother's elegant handwriting still clear after 22 years. She wrote to my father about marriage, about love, about what she hoped for me. Charlotte read aloud. Harrison, I know you worry about Charlotte's future, about protecting her from fortune hunters and ensuring her security. But what I want for our daughter isn't security. It's the kind of love we found together. The kind that grows from friendship and respect and genuine affection. The kind that makes two people better than they were alone. Don't force her into a marriage of convenience. Let her find someone who sees her heart, not her bank account. Michael was quiet for a long moment after Charlotte finished reading. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. I think she would have liked you. Because I saw your heart before I knew about the bank account. Because you make me want to be better than I am alone. Michael slipped the ring onto Charlotte's finger. Not her ring finger, but her right hand, a promise rather than a proposal. So what do we do now? Now we stop living like we're still pretending, Charlotte said, looking down at the simple band that somehow felt more meaningful than any piece of jewelry she'd ever owned. We combine our bank accounts. We make joint decisions about the house, the gallery, our future. We give them so much evidence of a real marriage that they can't possibly argue otherwise. And if the investigation still concludes we're fraudulent, then we'll have 6 months of really living as husband and wife instead of actors playing parts. Charlotte met his eyes. Would that be enough for you? If we lost everything but had each other? Michael's answer was to kiss her, deep and certain and full of promises neither of them had dared make before. When they broke apart, Charlotte felt something shift in her chest, the last of her walls coming down, the final distance between them closing. There's one more thing, she said. Something I should have told you weeks ago. What? I love you? The words came out simple and clear. No hesitation or qualification. Not because you're convenient or because you saved me from my father's deadline, but because you're kind and thoughtful and you read poetry in my garden at night. Because you fix things without being asked and you listen like what I'm saying actually matters. Because you make me feel like the person I always wanted to be. Michael's eyes went soft. I love you too. Have for weeks. I was just too scared to say it. Scared of what? Of this, he said, gesturing around them. Of losing it before I really had it. Of wanting something so much that losing it would break. And now I'd rather be broken trying than safe hiding. They spent the evening planning their defense like generals preparing for war. Charlotte called her bank to add Michael to all her accounts. Michael wrote a detailed timeline of their relationship's evolution, documenting the shift from business arrangement to genuine partnership. They drafted a list of friends and colleagues who could testify about the changes they'd witnessed. We should move your things into the main house, Charlotte said as they reviewed their strategy. If investigators are watching, separate living quarters won't help our case. Are you sure? That's a big step. We're married, Michael. It's time we started acting like it. The next morning, they began the process of truly combining their lives. Michael's few possessions, his books, his mother's photographs, the worn leather journal where he wrote his thoughts found places throughout Charlotte's house. His coffee mug sat next to hers in the kitchen cabinet. His reading glasses appeared on the nightstand. Small changes that transformed the space from Charlotte's house into their home. But the most significant change was harder to document. It was the way they moved around each other with growing familiarity, the casual touches that no longer felt rehearsed, the easy domesticity that developed as they stopped performing their relationship and started living it. This feels different, Charlotte said one morning as they shared breakfast on the patio, reading sections of the newspaper to each other. Different how? Real, like we belong together instead of like we're trying to convince people we belong. Together, Michael reached across the small table to touch her hand, the one wearing his mother's ring. I was thinking the same thing. These past few days, I keep forgetting this started as pretend. Maybe because it's not pretend anymore. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by Maria's arrival, with news that sent Charlotte's stomach plummeting. Miss Grant, Mrs. Chun, Maria corrected herself, still adjusting to Charlotte's married name. There's been a development with the investigation. What kind of development? Walsh wants to interview the staff. He's asking questions about your relationship timeline, about Mr. Chen's background, about... Maria paused, looking uncomfortable. About what, Maria? About whether. We think the marriage is real. Charlotte felt Michael tense beside her. This was what they'd been dreading. The investigation moving. Beyond financial records and photographs to personal testimony from people who'd observed their relationship firsthand. What did you tell him? I told him I'd need to speak with you. Before answering any questions. Maria's expression was fiercely protective. But Miss Grant, I think you should know he's also been asking questions around the neighborhood. About Mr. Chun's background. About when he first appeared here. Charlotte's blood ran cold. If Walsh was conducting a neighborhood canvass, it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the truth about Michael's homelessness. Someone would remember seeing him sleeping behind the gallery, or recognize him from his months on the streets. How long do we have? Michael asked. I don't know, Maria said, but I think you should prepare for the worst. After Maria left, Charlotte and Michael sat in stunned silence, the weight of their situation settling over them like a suffocating blanket. They're going to find out everything, Michael said finally. About where I was living when we met, about the circumstances that led to our arrangement. Let them find out, Charlotte said, surprised by her own calm. We'll tell them the truth, all of it. Yes, you were homeless. Yes, I offered you marriage as a solution to both our problems. But we'll also tell them what happened after that. What? If the truth isn't enough. Charlotte looked at him. This man who'd become essential to her happiness in ways she was still discovering, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. Then we'll make it enough, she said. We'll fight this thing with everything we have, and if we lose, at least we'll lose together. Michael nodded, and Charlotte saw him make the same decision she was making, to stop protecting themselves and start protecting each other, whatever the cost. Together, he agreed, and Charlotte knew that whatever came next, they would face it as partners in the truest sense of the word. The formal deposition took place in Harold Pemberton's conference room on a gray December morning, 6 months after Charlotte's impulsive proposal in the alley behind her gallery. Walsh sat across from them with a younger associate, both men armed with folders thick with evidence and expressions of professional skepticism. Mrs. Chen, Walsh began, his tone suggesting he doubted her right to the name. Let's start with the timeline of your relationship with the defendant. He's not a defendant, Charlotte said calmly. He's my husband. Of course, Walsh's smile was thin. Tell me about your first meeting with Mr. Chen. Charlotte had practiced this moment, but sitting here under the fluorescent lights with everything she cared about hanging in the balance, the rehearsed words felt inadequate. She looked at Michael, sitting beside her with the quiet dignity he brought to everything, and decided to abandon their careful script. I found him reading behind my gallery, she said. It was late, and I was leaving work, and there was this man sitting against the building with a book. The Great Gatsby, I think. And this was when, exactly, October 15th, a Thursday. Just 2 days before you learned about your father's marriage clause. Charlotte felt the trap in the question, but refused to be intimidated. Yes, quite a coincidence. Not really. I learned about the marriage clause on Friday. I learned about the marriage clause on Friday. I made my proposal to Michael the following Thursday. After a week of consideration, after a week of getting to know him. Walsh consulted his notes. According to our investigation, Mr. Chen was homeless at the time of your first meeting, living on the streets for approximately 8 months. Charlotte felt Michael tense beside her, but his voice was steady when he answered. That's correct. And you, Mrs. Chen, offered marriage to a homeless man you'd known for 7 days? I offered a mutually beneficial arrangement to a man whose character I'd come to respect in those 7 days. Character? Walsh's eyebrows rose. What character could you possibly assess in such a short time? This was the moment Charlotte had been preparing for. The chance to explain what she'd seen in Michael that first week that had made her trust him with her entire future. I saw someone who read classic literature while living on the street. Someone who was polite and grateful when offered coffee, who never asked for money or made me feel unsafe. Someone who spoke intelligently about art and life, despite being in circumstances that would break most people. Charlotte's voice grew stronger. As she spoke, I saw dignity in the face of catastrophe and kindness despite having every reason to be bitter. Pretty words, Mrs. Chen, but let's talk about practical matters. Did you conduct a background check before proposing marriage? Yes. And what did you find? Harold slid a folder across the table. Mr. Chen's complete background report. Clean. Criminal record. 9 years of excellent employment reviews as a high school English teacher. Financial ruin due to caring for his terminally ill mother. Walsh scanned the documents with obvious disappointment. Mr. Chen, tell me about your financial situation when you married Mrs. Chen. I had no money, no home, no prospects, Michael said simply. I was entirely dependent on charity and luck for my daily survival. And now? Now I'm listed on my wife's bank accounts and have access to considerable financial resources. How convenient. Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest, but Michael's hand found hers under the table, steadying her. "Mr. Walsh," Michael said, his voice calm but firm, "you're absolutely right that this arrangement began as a matter of mutual convenience. Charlotte needed a husband to satisfy her father's will, and I needed a chance to rebuild my life. But you're wrong if you think that's all it is now." "What is it now, Mr. Chen?" Michael looked at Charlotte, and she saw none of the careful performance they practiced for public events. This was simply a man looking at the woman he loved. Now it's a marriage. Real in every way that matters. We share a home, a life, decisions about our future. We support each other through difficulties and celebrate each other's successes. We've combined our financial lives and our personal lives completely. Very touching. But the timing remains suspicious. "The timing is irrelevant," Charlotte said. "People fall in love on different schedules. Some take years, some take months, some take days. What matters isn't how quickly it happened, but that it happened genuinely." Walsh leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Chen, if your marriage is as genuine as you claim, you won't mind a more thorough investigation. Financial audits, personal interviews with friends and family, psychological evaluations. We welcome any investigation you think is necessary," Charlotte said without hesitation. "Even if it takes months? Even if it exposes every private detail of your relationship to scrutiny?" Charlotte looked at Michael, seeing her own determination reflected in his expression. They had come too far and found something too precious to back down now. "Mr. Walsh," she said, "we have nothing to hide because we have everything to fight for." Walsh's expression suggested he'd expected them to cave under pressure, to reveal cracks in their story or their resolve. Instead, he was facing two people who'd made peace with their past and were prepared to defend their future. "Very well," he said, closing his folder. "We'll be in touch." As they left the building together, Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The call came on a Tuesday morning in January, almost exactly 1 year after Charlotte had first learned about her father's marriage clause. Harold's voice was carefully neutral when he asked them to come to his office immediately. "Is it good news or bad news?" Charlotte asked as they sat across from the elderly lawyer. "It's complicated news," Harold said. "Walsh has concluded his investigation." Charlotte felt Michael's hand tighten around hers. They'd spent the past month enduring interviews, financial audits, and psychological evaluations that had laid bare every aspect of their relationship. Friends had been questioned, colleagues interviewed, their most private moments dissected by strangers. "And?" Michael asked. "His official finding is that your marriage began as a contractual arrangement designed to circumvent Harrison's will, but has evolved into a genuine partnership." Harold paused. "However, Theodore is arguing that the fraudulent origins invalidate the entire arrangement, regardless of its current status." Charlotte's heart sank. "So we lose?" "Not necessarily. I have a few cards left to play." Harold pulled out a thick legal brief. "First, your mother's will creates a significant legal complication for Theodore's case. Her intention to provide you with an unconditional inheritance suggests your father's marriage clause may have been legally questionable from the beginning. What does that mean practically? It means we can argue that you were entitled to inherit, regardless of your marital status, making the authenticity of your marriage irrelevant." Harold's smile was sharp. "But more importantly, I have something Walsh doesn't know we have." He turned his computer screen toward them, showing a video file dated just 2 weeks ago. "This is security footage from your gallery," Walsh requested. "It is part of his investigation, but he was specifically looking for evidence from your early relationship. He never asked for recent footage." Harold played the video. It showed Charlotte and Michael in the gallery after hours, working together to hang a new exhibition. There was nothing dramatic about the scene, just two people moving in comfortable synchronization, Michael holding paintings while Charlotte adjusted lighting, both of them pausing occasionally to discuss placement or simply to share a private smile? I don't understand, Charlotte said. How does this help us? Watch their body language, Harold said. This isn't performance for an audience. They didn't know the camera was recording. This is how they interact when no one is watching. Compare it to the formal, careful interactions from their early public appearances. Charlotte watched herself on screen, seeing what Harold meant. The woman in the video moved around Michael with unconscious familiarity, touching his arm to get his attention, leaning against him naturally while they studied a piece. Michael, in turn, responded to her presence with the easy intimacy of someone who'd grown accustomed to her rhythms and preferences. The transformation is remarkable, Harold continued. In the early footage, you're both clearly performing. Here, you're simply being yourselves. Together. Is that enough? Michael asked. Combined with the other evidence, your financial integration, the witness testimony about your changed relationship dynamic, your mother's will, I think we have a strong case. Harold leaned forward. But there's something else. Something that might end this entire battle. He pulled out another document official letterhead from the state attorney general's office. Theodore made a mistake. In his eagerness to challenge your marriage, he made some statements to Walsh that constitute defamation. Accusations of fraud. Without sufficient evidence, implications about your character and Michael's motivations that cross legal lines. Charlotte stared at the document. Are you saying we can sue Theodore? I'm saying Theodore is about to face some very expensive legal problems of his own, which makes him suddenly very interested in settling this matter quietly. As if summoned by their conversation, Harold's secretary knocked on the door. Mr. Pemberton? Theodore Grant is here. He says it's urgent. 5 minutes later, Charlotte found herself facing the cousin who'd been trying to steal her inheritance for the past year. Theodore looked older, more worn than she remembered, and his usual arrogance had been replaced by something that looked like desperation. Charlotte, he said, ignoring Michael entirely. I think we need to talk. I think we're past talking, Theodore. Look, this whole thing has gotten out of hand. The investigation, the legal fees, the public attention, it's not what I wanted. What did you want? Charlotte asked. I wanted what was fair. Your father built that company from nothing, and I've worked for it my entire adult life while you played with paintings and artists. And you thought the best way to claim your inheritance was to destroy my marriage? Theodore glanced at Michael, and Charlotte saw something shift in his expression. I thought your marriage was fake. I was convinced you'd hired some actor to play the part for a year. And now I've read the investigator's report, heard the witness testimony, seen the evidence. Theodore's voice was grudging, and I think I was wrong. You think? I know I was wrong. About the marriage, about your motivations, about... He stopped, struggling with words. About you. I never gave you credit for building something real with the gallery, with your life. I always saw you as Harrison's spoiled daughter instead of the woman who turned a small art business into something significant. Charlotte stared at her cousin, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Why are you telling me this now? Because I'm dropping the challenge, officially withdrawing my claim to the estate. The words hung in the air like a gift Charlotte was afraid to accept. Why? Theodore looked at Michael, then back at Charlotte. Because I realized something watching you two during this investigation. You found something worth fighting for. And maybe that's worth more than any inheritance. 1 year later, Charlotte stood in the same spot where she'd first noticed Michael reading behind her gallery, but everything else had changed. The alley had been transformed into a small garden courtyard, part of the gallery's expansion into community outreach programs. Where Michael had once huddled against the brick wall, comfortable benches now invited visitors to sit and read among carefully tended flowers. The irony isn't lost on me, Michael said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee, their morning ritual, unchanged despite all the transformations around them. What irony! That the place where I was at my lowest point is now where we help other people find their footing. Charlotte smiled, looking at the small plaque mounted on the garden wall. The Elizabeth Grant Community Reading Garden, a place for new beginnings. They'd named it for her mother, whose letters had taught them both something about the difference between marriages of convenience and marriages of choice. "Speaking of new beginnings," Charlotte said, pulling an envelope from her jacket pocket. "This came today." Michael opened it carefully, his expression shifting from curiosity to wonder as he read. "The Brooklyn School District wants to interview me for a teaching position. Head of the English department at the high school where you used to work. Apparently, your former principal has been following your work with our literacy program. Over the past year, Michael had developed a reading initiative that brought literature to homeless shelters and community centers throughout the city. What had started as a small volunteer effort had grown into a significant program, funded by the gallery and administered through partnerships with local schools and social services. I didn't apply for this position," Michael said, still staring at the letter. "No, but you earned it. Every Tuesday night for the past year, working with kids who remind you of your former students. Every weekend at the shelter, teaching adults to read or helping them with GED preparation." Charlotte touched his arm. "You've been teaching all along, Michael. This is just making it official. What about the program here?" What about what? The program will continue. We'll hire staff, develop curriculum, maybe even expand to other cities. But you belong in a classroom, and we both know it." Michael set down his coffee and pulled Charlotte into his arms, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "Are you trying to get rid of me, Mrs. Chun?" "Never. But I am trying to make sure you have your own life, your own purpose, separate from being my husband." It was something they talked about extensively, the importance of maintaining individual identities within their partnership. Charlotte had her gallery and her growing reputation as a curator of emerging artists. Michael needed his own professional fulfillment, something that belonged to him alone. "Besides," Charlotte added with a grin, "Brooklyn isn't that far. You could commute, or we could move." "Move?" Charlotte looked around at the gallery that had been her life's work, the neighborhood where she'd grown up, the house where they built their marriage. "I've been thinking about it," Michael said. "This place is beautiful, but it's also full of ghosts. Your father's expectations, the investigation, all the drama of this past year. Maybe it's time for a fresh start." Charlotte considered this. The idea should have terrified her, leaving behind everything familiar, starting over in a new place. Instead, she felt a flutter of excitement. Where would we go? Brooklyn. A real neighborhood instead of this rarefied bubble. A smaller place where we could have a garden and maybe room for the family we've been talking about. Family. The word still gave Charlotte a little thrill. At 35, she'd thought that dream had passed her by. But Michael had changed her mind about many things she'd thought were settled. "You want to have children in Brooklyn?" "I want to have children with you. The geography is negotiable." Charlotte laughed, pulling him closer. "You realize this is the opposite of what my father intended when he wrote that marriage clause. Instead of keeping me tied to his legacy, marriage is setting me free from it. Maybe that's exactly what your mother intended when she wrote her will. Maybe she knew you'd need permission to leave." They were interrupted by Maria, who emerged from the gallery with her usual efficient energy. "Mrs. Chun, the photographer from Art Forum, is here for your interview. And Mr. Chun, your students from the literacy program are asking if you're still planning to attend their graduation ceremony tonight." "Of course," Michael said. "I wouldn't miss it." As Maria headed back inside, Charlotte marveled at how naturally Michael had become part of the community, how easily people had accepted him as her partner, rather than her employee or charity case. The investigation had been brutal, but it had, Also forced them to be completely honest about their relationship with others and with themselves. "Are you ready for this interview?" Michael asked. "Being featured in art form is a big deal." "It's not about me," Charlotte said. "It's about the community programs, about what happens when galleries engage with social issues instead of just serving collectors. It's about you too, about the vision that made these programs possible." Charlotte looked around at what they built together, not just the physical space, but the marriage, the community, the life that had grown from their improbable beginning. A year ago, she'd been a lonely woman facing an impossible deadline. Now she was part of something larger than herself, connected to Michael and to the community they served in ways she couldn't have imagined. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The way we started? The chaos and uncertainty and investigation?" Michael was quiet for a moment, considering. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that your father couldn't see who you really were, and that my circumstances were so desperate that marriage felt like my only option." He paused, looking at her with the same gray-green eyes that had first caught her attention in this very spot. "But I don't regret that it led us to each other. However it happened, whatever brought us together, I'm grateful for every step that led to this moment." Charlotte stood on her toes to kiss him, tasting coffee and possibility in the promise of all the tomorrows they would build together. "So," she said when they broke apart, "Brooklyn?" "Brooklyn," Michael agreed. "New beginnings, Mrs. Chun." "New beginnings, Mr. Chun." And as they walked back into the gallery to face whatever came next, Charlotte realized that the best marriage clauses weren't written by lawyers or fathers. They were written by two people choosing each other, again and again, one day at a time.